The silence in the cabin was a physical thing, as solid and as cold as the packed snow that buried the world outside. For 8 months it had been Caleb's only companion, a shroud he had pulled over himself after the fire took everything but the air in his lungs. He was a man carved from the mountain itself, huge and unmoving, his beard a tangle of frost and memory, his hair a wild mane that fell over shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of a world. The silence was his penance, his shield, his tomb. It had been 8 months since a word had passed his lips. Then came the sound. A frantic, desperate scratching at his door, a sound too weak to be a bear, too insistent to be the wind. He rose from his stool by the hearth, the movement slow, deliberate, the groan of the wood under his weight the loudest noise the cabin had heard in weeks. He lifted the heavy bar, his massive hand covering the worn oak, and pulled the door inward. A blast of frozen air and swirling snow greeted him, and with it 2 figures, small and fragile against the fury of the winter. They were identical, their faces pale masks of desperation, their dark eyes enormous pools of fear. They wore dresses of a pale pink silk, utterly wrong for the savage landscape, the fabric torn and stained, but still clinging to a memory of another world. They were twins, and they looked at him as if he were both their salvation and their final damnation. They collapsed at his threshold, a tangle of limbs and pink silk in the snow. One of them, her breath a white plume in the biting air, looked up at him, her voice a reedy whisper that cut through his 8 months of quiet. "Please," she begged, her words catching on a sob. Her sister stirred, lifting her head to echo the plea, their gazes locked on his impassive face. They spoke in unison, a haunting, broken chorus against the storm. "Choose one of us." Caleb stared down at them, the request so strange, so impossible, that it didn't fully register. His mind, long accustomed to the simple, brutal logic of survival, hunt, chop, endure, could not process the calculus of their plea. He saw only 2 people about to be consumed by the winter. Without a word, he reached down, his arms scooping them both up as if they were nothing more than kindling. He carried them inside, their combined weight barely a challenge, and deposited them on the bearskin rug before the fire. The warmth of the hearth immediately began to melt the ice crystals in their hair, making them glitter like fallen stars. He shut the door, the heavy thud of the bar falling back into place, sealing the 3 of them inside his silent world. He moved about the cabin with an economy born of long solitude, fetching thick wool blankets and draping them over their shivering forms. He ladled hot broth from the pot simmering over the fire into 2 wooden bowls, the steam rising to mist their frozen faces. They took the bowls with trembling hands, their eyes never leaving him, watching his every move with the intensity of cornered animals. He retreated to his stool, the space between them charged with unspoken questions. In the flickering firelight he saw the ghosts that haunted him. He saw his wife, her smile as warm as this very hearth, and his daughter, her laughter the sound the silence had murdered. The fire had taken them, leaving him with nothing but the crackle of burning pine and the hollow echo in his own chest. His silence wasn't a choice, it was a scar, the place where his voice used to be. And now these 2 women, these apparitions from a world away, had brought their own ghosts into his, asking him to perform an act of judgment he was no longer capable of. He looked at their identical faces, the fine bones, the dark, almond-shaped eyes, and felt the weight of their desperate hope. It was a weight he had not felt in a long, long time. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light outside the single grimy window. The storm raged, then subsided, leaving behind a world of pristine, deadly white. Inside the cabin a new rhythm established itself, a quiet choreography of survival. The sisters, whose names he learned were Leanne and Anne, moved with a strange, mirrored grace. They spoke to each other in a soft, flowing language he didn't understand, their voices a gentle stream against the rocks of his silence. He learned them not by their words, but by their actions. Anne was the bolder of the two, her movements more decisive. She would take the broom and sweep the floor with a fierce energy, organize his haphazard stacks of dried herbs, and stare directly at him, her gaze challenging and questioning. Leanne was the ghost, her presence softer, more ephemeral. She would mend the tear in his buckskin shirt with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, her slender fingers working the needle with a quiet artistry. She would sit by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes distant, as if watching a world only she could see. They were two halves of a single soul. To watch them was to watch a conversation conducted without speech, a dance of perfect understanding. Anne would reach for a log for the fire, and Leanne would already be there, holding it out for her. Leanne would shiver, and Anne would drape a blanket over her shoulders before the cold had fully registered. Caleb watched them from the fortress of his silence, a strange feeling stirring in the frozen soil of his heart. The cabin, which had been a mausoleum for his memories, was now filled with the scent of their herbs, the whisper of their language, the soft rustle of their movements. It was alive again, and the new life terrified him as much as it soothed him. He felt the ice within him beginning to crack, and he didn't know if what lay beneath was a river or a flood. The deep winter settled in, a suffocating blanket of cold and isolation. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin. The initial relief on the faces of Leanne and Anne slowly hardened into a new kind of anxiety. They had found shelter, but they had not found a future. They studied Caleb, trying to read the unreadable landscape of his face, searching for a sign, a preference, anything that would tell them how to secure their place in this strange, silent world. The unspoken tension grew thicker than the frost on the window pane. They began to compete in small, almost imperceptible ways. When he returned from checking his trap lines, his beard crusted with ice, Anne would be the first to take his heavy coat, her touch lingering for a moment on his arm. Leanne would have a bowl of hot stew ready, her eyes downcast but watchful as she offered it to him. Anne would tell stories in broken English, stories of a faraway land with paper lanterns and bustling markets, her voice animated, trying to draw a reaction from him, a smile, a nod, anything. Leanne would sing, her voice a low, haunting melody that seemed to speak of ancient sorrows, her song filling the cabin with a profound melancholy that resonated with his own. He saw their desperation, saw the terrible weight of their plea, "Choose one of us," enacting itself in every small gesture. They believed their survival was a zero-sum game. They saw themselves not as sisters, but as rivals in a silent life-or-death contest. He felt like a callous god, their fate held in his hands, and his inaction was a form of torture. But the silence held him fast. To speak would be to give shape to the ghosts, to admit the world had moved on while he had remained buried, and to choose was to destroy. He had watched his world burn once. He would not be the one to light the match again. One evening, as the shadows grew long and the fire cast dancing figures on the log walls, they approached him together. They stood before his chair, their hands clasped, their two faces a mirror of solemn resolve. It was Anne who spoke, her English clearer now, honed by weeks of observation. "We cannot stay like this," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It is not right." Leanne nodded, her gaze fixed on the floorboards. "We are a burden. 2 mouths, 2 bodies. A man needs a wife, not 2. Anne took a breath, her knuckles white where she gripped her sister's hand. "In our home, a man provides. He protects. In return, a woman keeps his house. She is his wife. We can do this. We are strong. We can work. But you must choose." Her eyes lifted to meet his, and for the first time he saw not just fear, but a profound, weary dignity. "Choose one of us to be your wife. The other will..." serve, or she will go. We will not be a disgrace to your house." The words hung in the air, stark and terrible. They were offering him a choice that was no choice at all. They were asking him to sever a bond that was as essential as breathing, to cut a soul in two. They saw it as a matter of honor, of practicality, the only way they could imagine to repay their debt and secure a future. They could not see that to him, they were not two separate problems to be solved. They were a single, miraculous event. They were the first sign of life after a long, dead winter. He looked from Anne's defiant, proud face to Leanne's gentle, resilient one. They were the same, yet impossibly different. One was the shield, the other the heart. How could a man choose between the heart and the shield? How could he live without both? The silence in the cabin was no longer his alone. It was now filled with their impossible question. Caleb felt the foundations of his silent world crumble. The plea forced him to confront the future, a concept he had abandoned 8 months ago. For days, he was lost in a storm within himself that was more violent than any blizzard raging outside. He looked at Anne, her fierce determination a reflection of the will to live he thought he had lost. He saw her scrubbing the floors, her jaw set, as if she could scour away their uncertainty through sheer force. He looked at Leanne, her quiet grace a balm on his raw nerves. He saw her sitting by the window, watching the snow fall, her expression one of profound, sorrowful acceptance, and in her stillness he recognized the shape of his own grief. To choose on would be to choose a life of forward momentum, of rebuilding. To choose Leanne would be to choose a life of quiet contemplation, of healing. But to choose one was to sentence the other. Where would she go? Into the snow, to be found frozen in the spring thaw? Back to whatever danger they had fled? The thought was a physical pain, a sharp echo of the loss that had hollowed him out. He remembered his wife and daughter, so different from one another, a whirlwind of laughter and a quiet pool of calm. He had lost them both in the same instant. They had been taken from him as a unit, a complete family erased in a single night. Now faced with these two sisters, who were so intertwined they seemed to share a single breath, the idea of separating them felt like a profanity. It felt like a repetition of the cruelest act of fate. He could not do it. He would not. The choice was not between Leanne and Anne. The choice was between the man he was, a silent monument to the dead, and the man he could be. The silence had been his refuge, but he was beginning to see that it was also his prison. The tension in the cabin became a living entity, a suffocating presence that left no room for breath. Leanne and Anne interpreted his continued silence as rejection. Their hope, which had flickered so bravely, began to die. They moved like wraiths, their shared glances now filled with a quiet, heartbreaking resignation. The small rivalries ceased, replaced by a shared, somber preparation for the inevitable. They believed he had refused their offer, that their time in this warm sanctuary was over. One morning he woke to see them packing. It wasn't much. A few small carved trinkets wrapped in silk, the worn cheongsams folded neatly. An was methodically bundling dried meat and hard biscuits into a small satchel. Leanne was mending a tear in their shared traveling cloak, her fingers moving with a sad, final precision. They were preparing to walk back into the white oblivion from which they had come. Watching them, Caleb felt a visceral, gut-wrenching panic. The thought of this cabin returning to its state of absolute silence, of the warmth they had brought being extinguished, was more than he could bear. The ghosts of his past were one thing. They were memories, fixed and unchanging. The departure of Leanne and An would be a new death, a fresh wound inflicted upon the old. He had been a passive observer of his own life for too long. He rose from his bed, the sheer size of him filling the small space, and the sisters froze, their eyes wide with apprehension. They thought this was it, the moment he would cast them out. He walked toward them, his expression unreadable, and the silence stretched, thin and taut, ready to snap. He knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he could not let them go. He could not survive another emptiness. He did not speak. The words were still locked away, rusted shut. But his actions became his voice. He reached Anne first. She flinched, expecting a harsh word or a gesture toward the door. Instead, his large, calloused hand gently took the satchel of food from her grasp. He placed it back on the shelf with a quiet finality. He then turned to Leanne, who was clutching the cloak to her chest like a shield. He took the cloak from her, his touch surprisingly gentle, and hung it back on its wooden peg by the door. He stood between them for a long moment, the only sound the crackle of the fire and their sharp, indrawn breaths. Then he did something that stunned them into absolute stillness. He reached out and took both of their hands, Anne's in his right, Leanne's in his left. He held them, his grip firm and steady, a silent anchor. He looked from one sister to the other, meeting their wide, questioning eyes. He held their gaze, letting them see past the wild beard and the long hair, letting them see into the vast, lonely expanse of his grief. And in that space, they saw something else taking root, a fierce, undeniable protectiveness. He gave a single, slow shake of his head. It was a simple gesture, but it held a universe of meaning. No. No choice. No departure. No separation. In that one movement, he answered their impossible question with an impossible solution. He was not choosing one. He was choosing them. He was choosing this strange, unforeseen life that had washed up on his doorstep. He was choosing to keep the warmth, to keep the whispers of their language, to keep the heart and the shield. He was choosing both. As the snows of the deep winter began to melt, so too did the ice around Caleb's heart. The spring arrived tentatively at first, then with a rush of green that felt like a miracle. The world outside the cabin was reborn, and something inside was reborn with it. His first word was a croak, a sound scraped from a dry well. He was pointing to the dwindling woodpile. "Wood," he rasped, the single syllable costing him a monumental effort. Anne and Leanne stared at him, their eyes shining with unshed tears. It was the first time they had heard his voice. Slowly, painstakingly, more words followed. He would say their names. Anne. Leanne. His voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the mountain itself. He learned the rhythm of speech again, just as they learned the rhythm of a life with him. It was a life that defied every convention they had ever known, yet it worked. They worked. Anne, with her boundless energy, took to the garden he helped her clear, her hands coaxing life from the rich mountain soil. Leanne, with her quiet patience, learned to set snares and read the signs of the forest, her gentle nature masking a core of resilient steel. They were no longer two separate entities vying for a position. They were a unit, a three-person household that moved and worked in a harmony born of shared survival and a strange, unspoken understanding. He never explained his choice, and they never asked. The explanation was in the way he would mend a handle on a tool for Anne, or the way he would bring Leanne a rare mountain flower he found on his hunts. The explanation was in the shared meals, the quiet evenings by the fire, the slow, steady building of a home where there had only been a shelter. He had not taken a wife. He had accepted a family. Years passed like the turning of the seasons on the mountain. The light pink cheongsams, long since worn to threads, were replaced by practical dresses of deerskin and wool, sewn by their own hands. Caleb's beard was now streaked with silver, and the lines around his eyes spoke not just of sorrow, but of a quiet, hard-won contentment. Their life was an oddity, a myth whispered by the few trappers who passed through the lower valleys, but on their mountain they were simply a family. He never lost the ghost of sadness in his eyes, The memory of the wife and daughter he had lost was a part of him, like the granite bones of the mountain. But it was no longer a void that threatened to consume him. It was a space that had been made larger, a space that could now hold the quiet love he felt for Leanne and the fierce respect he had for Ann. He would sometimes watch them as they worked together, grinding corn or preserving berries, their movements still a perfect mirrored dance. They still spoke in their own tongue, a soft musical counterpoint to the sighing of the wind in the pines. He had given them sanctuary, and they, in turn, had given him back his life. They had walked out of a storm and shown him that the silence he had mistaken for a tomb could, in fact, become a home. He looked at them, these two women who were the heart and the shield, the quiet stream and the burning fire, and he finally understood. The question they had asked him all those years ago had been the wrong one. It was never about who he would choose. It was about whether he would choose to live again. And his answer, every single day, was them.